Hi everyone, Phil Travis here, and this week's lesson is on Bismarck's Germany, Otto von Bismarck's time at the helm of the unified Germany from really 1871 to 1888. So the results of Bismarck's wars of unification, the war with the Danish, the war with the Austrians, and then of course most notably the war with Napoleon III, the Franco-Prussian War of 1871, resulted in the growth of Germany as a dominant Central European power. And in this respect, Germany, many European powers, whether it was the Russians or the British or the French, these powers were greatly concerned that Germany would offset the balance of power. Balance of power in the old world of Europe of the 1800s refers to effectively the balance of various powers in the international world and the position, particularly after the fall of Napoleon, that European powers would effectively gang up on another power if that country became so powerful that they offset the balance of power. It was designed to create stability by not allowing any one country to become exceptionally dominant. Wars like the Crimean War, for example, were fought by the British and the French against Russia to prevent Russia from becoming more of an offsetting force in the balance of power. So as a result of the wars of unification, Germany becomes the dominant Central European power. And there was concern from other countries around them, like Russia and France and so forth, that they would offset the balance of power. And this led Bismarck to, as we'll talk about a little bit later in this presentation, we'll see Bismarck really go to great lengths to try to create an alliance system that allows Germany to be free of war from whether France or Russia. He was very keen to at least convince Europeans that Germany was content within its borders and wasn't going to expand. Bismarck's wars of unification were unifications from above, and in some respects, even though the liberals, as you read, really become the primary ally in the first portion of Bismarck's leadership, they really become his primary ally. But it is, in a lot of respects, also the end of the ideal constitutional alternative that liberals had pushed for in the lead up to unification. And it's increasingly going to be a country that is ruled by by elites. Elites with relation to a monarchy, the state, army, church, Prussian Junkers, and so forth. And this picture is of the Victory Parade in Berlin after the Franco-Prussian War. Germany was divided as a country. The Kaiserreich was composed of a diversity of states. It was multi-ethnic. There were different variations of religious faith and of religious strength in the different regions. And there was an array of governments and legal systems. These various states were all represented in the Reichstag, and the Reichstag was a German parliament. And as we see the development in Bismarck in Germany, you see a continual effort of Bismarck to try to expand the federal power, the federal state power over that of the independent states within the Reichstag. And so Bismarck was increasingly pushing the country towards, if you will, a national and federally directed consolidation, as he felt that this was the only way to really make Germany a great and viable power. During Bismarck's time at the helm, and this artistic depiction it's a political cartoon, depicts Bismarck as the helmsman, and on the wheel of the ship you can see conservative, you can see ultramontane, and you can see liberal. And those refer to the dominant forces within Germany that Bismarck tries to effectively build his support behind by effectively creating various compromises across the board. Now, through his time, he will effectively use enemies of the state as a way to create unification. The first enemy of the state were the Catholics, and he directed to much of the glee of liberals at the time. And when we say liberals, we're talking about really economic liberals. We're talking about individuals who believe in free trade. We're talking about individuals who believe the promotion of a privatized, industrial capitalist economy. Individuals who oppose the traditions of feudalism and aristocratic nobility. And they were typically very opposed to, or relatively opposed to the Catholic Church. And during the first phase of Bismarck's reign, the liberals and Bismarck were sort of allies of convenience. They both had a lot of the similar goals in terms of promoting sort of free market economic principles. They disagreed on certain areas, but they were allies during the first phase. And we see over the progression of the Bismarckian era that Bismarck originally is more of a liberal, promoting liberal economic principles, and then he becomes more conservative economically and begins promoting tariffs and protectionism. And in the second phase, he targets not the Catholic Church, but rather the socialists. And so Bismarck's targets and these enemies of the states are usually used as a tool of Bismarck to create national unity and create a consolidated unity behind his leadership by targeting sort of enemies of the state. The reasons that Bismarck targets such groups is because, in some cases, a mixture of real fear, political, cultural, but also, and oftentimes more this, political manipulation to create, a negative consensus among dominant groups and to undercut resistance from other avenues, particularly to undercut resistance from liberals by effectively vilifying another group as an enemy of state and creating a common alliance with liberals and Bismarck. This slide depicts political cartoons during the Kulturkampf, which refers to the period of the Battle of Cultures is what it means. And it refers to the period during the early phase of Bismarck in Germany, where Germany, as a secular liberal state, engaged in a attack on Catholicism within the German continental empire. These two political cartoons depict Bismarck and Pope Leo as chess players, and the other demonstrating that Bismarck and the Pope had resolved their differences to join the forces against a new common enemy of Marxist socialism. And if you look at the picture, you can see Bismarck and the Pope holding back the door as you see the fiery torches of a radical mob sticking their hand and their feet through the door. So during the first phase of Bismarck's leadership, during the liberal phase, if you will, the economic liberal phase, the Catholic Church was a target as an enemy of the state, as a way of trying to create this federal German nation. But ultimately, with the rise of Marxist revolutionary movements and so forth in Germany, in the second phase, you see Germany really consolidate itself more with protectionism, more conservative economics, and with an attack on radical movements like the Marxist revolutionary movements. Germany during the industrial period experienced the rapid growth of class divisions, and one of the great products of this was the SPD, or the German Socialist Party. The SPD is the acronym that refers to the German Socialist Party, and massive industrialization in Germany came at a huge cost. There were huge working class that was a result of this that made up a total of a third of the population, and many of them worked in appalling conditions with little in the way of safety nets for if you get injured at work or for sickness or for health insurance. And so industrialization made society much more desperate. People worked in harsher conditions and harsher environments and were generally paid less than their skilled contemporaries of the pre-industrial era. During the 1880s, Marxism in Germany because of those reasons, became a very appealing, um, type of ideology, and it was appealing largely because it pitted the use of class struggle as the motive of history, or the motor of history. That class struggle was almost deterministic development in which a revolution of the proletariat will arise and will overthrow the capitalist status quo, and the worker will rise to the top of a revolutionary socialist society. And this political cartoon, the heading is "The Worker in the Club Room of the Ruling Class." And of course, Marxist revolutionary socialism became it was something that Bismarck feared greatly, because as well did liberals, as well did the conservatives in the so-called Center Party. They were all very concerned with Marxist socialism because of the radical possibility of a revolution that would completely undermine the rather elitist-led society. And so in the 1880s, Bismarck used an attack on the enemy of the state, of the Marxist, as a way of continuing to build support behind a more federally oriented German nation. The socialist response to Bismarck's persecution, though, was not that they would be destroyed. Instead, the SPD and German socialism in general really grew as a result of this. And this is obviously a German socialist newspaper. And the German Socialist Party was able to build a myth of martyrdom, that they were the subject of persecution, and that they became an underground organization that appealed to individuals that were particularly struggling in the industrial world, as a worker particularly. The German Socialist Party really began to grow, and by 1912 it was the largest German political party, making up some 35% of the vote. The German Socialist Democratic Party, or the SPD, really became the flagship of the European socialist movement, and it really acted more as a reformist socialism. So when we say reform socialism, we mean socialism that creates or regulates capitalism by passing various legal reforms within the political apparatus. Whereas revolutionary socialism, which is traditionally Marxism, seeks to overthrow the system and seize it by revolutionary force. And so the SPD really became more of a reformist socialist movement, but it remained very revolutionary in rhetoric. And it really, by the early 20th century, it was the leading socialist movement in Europe. It was the model, and it really built its electoral support, its political support, as a result of Bismarck's persecution. So it was to use the enemy of the state strategy by Bismarck really kind of backfired ultimately, as it may have created some elite political consensuses in Germany, but it really fails to eliminate the party. And the party will grow as largely a reaction not only to that persecution, but also as a reaction to the ills of industrial capitalism at this time. Increasingly, Marxist socialism creates fears at the outset of World War I, and of course these fears continue in the lead up to World War II, of a red flood, of a communist movement that would spread across Central Europe and completely transform the society. And this fear was very predominant in Germany. It was also ultimately going to be perceived as the ultimate threat coming from Russia after the Bolshevik Revolution at the end of World War I, or the latter stages of World War I. So the newspaper here is announcing that the lifting of the anti-socialist laws after the Bismarckian era, which was a huge breakthrough for the movement, as the anti-socialist laws really put the socialist movement under a great deal of persecution for arrest, for activity in these groups. Ironically, Bismarck's period, though, despite, I say ironically because Bismarck tended to promote economic liberalism, and then he promotes more of a conservative economics, but Bismarck generally was elitist and didn't really have social reforms as his primary motive. But ironically, he helps usher in social reforms, particularly following the Depression of 1873, and these reforms were absolutely hard fought. Members of the liberal parties, as well as the Center Party in Germany, fought tooth and nail against Bismarck, against many of these social reforms, and some of them took almost a decade to pass. But Bismarck was really ushering in these reforms, which were quite progressive, largely because he wanted to defang many of his opponents, and of course he wanted to take some of the thunder out of the social democracy movement and the revolutionary socialist movement. He wants to also use these types of welfare state policies to expand the strength of the federal government, which was a central position of his, and he was strongly opposed by groups like the Center Party, which were more states' rightist in their outlook. But Bismarck felt that you had to be a federal state, a nation, a unified nation, to become a strong power. And so Bismarck helped to usher in things like health insurance, in which if an individual was sick for 3 days, they could go and see a doctor. Accident insurance, a very meager but nonetheless present disability and old age pension. In the area of health insurance, Germany really led the way. In other areas, like when it came to regulating industrial capitalism, allowing for the development of, workers' rights within the industrial capitalism and these types of things, it was really Great Britain that led the way. But nonetheless, Germany enacted some very progressive steps forward after a very bad depression that hit the world in 1873. And this image you see, of course, is the Vienna stock market. There's a Black Friday on May 9th, 1873, when really the Western world experienced the first depression of the industrial age. And the industrialized world will continue to face these. We will see these in 1873, 1893. There's a panic in 1907, and of course, the Great Depression, of course, at the end of the 1920s and in the 1930s. And these were a product of the new global economy, the new global industrial capitalism, and European as well as the United States, though United States progressivism was pretty consistently behind chronologically than European progressives. American progressives really learned a lot from European progressives who were doing the same things, as was exampled here, before they were doing it. Now, this is not really to say that Bismarck is truly a progressive. And we say progressive, of course, we're talking about a general movement of social reform in the latter 19th century, early 20th century to moderate the industrial capitalism and thereby prevent the development of revolutions, particularly socialist Marxist revolutions. Bismarck's not truly a progressive. Bismarck's trying to strengthen the state. He's trying to defang his enemies. He's trying to bolster the power of the federal state while also limiting the attractiveness of some of the what were seen as more radical movements, like the socialist movements, whether the revolutionary socialism or whether a reform socialist movement. But nonetheless, these were examples of progressive reform. And in the area of health insurance, Germany really led the way at this time. But in other areas, countries like Great Britain and France were much more advanced in terms of providing these various types of assistance to individuals, to working individuals, and people that, if you had a series of layoffs, or if you were injured, or if you got sick, these people would have some recourse, some kind of safety net to protect their, at least to some degree, their basic well-being. Ultimately, it did not halt the development of social democracy, and that's largely because the situation remained desperate. Despite this, more and more workers, if you go back to the earlier slide, a third of the workers a third of the population were workers by the 1890s. And, workers were still working in very difficult situations, harsh conditions, dangerous conditions, dirty conditions, and they weren't being paid fantastically great. And so they continued to be, very, in a very precarious position. And so it doesn't halt the development of social democracy. And as you saw in previous slides, in fact, various branches of reform socialism and revolutionary socialism actually expand after Bismarck's persecution, or persecution of them as enemies of the state. After Bismarck will be nudged out in 1888, and this begins the period of Wilhelmine Germany, in which Kaiser Wilhelm ruled Germany. And this political cartoon here, depicted as dropping the pilot, this was pretty disastrous for the Bismarckian system. The new Kaiser, which we'll talk more about next week, was impetuous, erratic, and he was really desperate to kind of step out of the shadow of Bismarck and become his own man. The Kaiser will really dismantle the fragile system of alliances that Bismarck had created, and will really bring about the decline of the Bismarckian system and the fragile social consensus that Bismarck had created in the founding of Germany. And we will talk more about this next week. So, Otto von Bismarck's major foreign policies. Bismarck was uniquely aware that Germany's position as a new major Central European power made them, one, particularly vulnerable, two, it made them, it placed them under the microscope of other European powers who were concerned that that the Germans would offset the balance of power in Central Europe. And so as a result of that, Bismarck went to great lengths to, one, convince European powers that he didn't have intentions to majorly expand German influence in continental Europe, but also Bismarck goes to great lengths to construct alliance systems that protect the strength and stability of the German nation. Bismarck was concerned that if Germany was perceived as throwing off the balance of power in Europe, that they could be ganged up on by other European powers, just in the way that, say, Napoleon was ganged up on. And if they were ganged up on by other European powers, they would be in a particularly unique and difficult situation, because geographically they would have major military powers on all sides of them. So Bismarck did a couple of things. He sought to isolate France. France was never going to be Germany's ally, and German annexation of Alsace and Lorraine after the Franco-Prussian War was particularly controversial with the French and with other European powers. Bismarck will create an alliance with Austria-Hungary, and Austria-Hungary was always the kind of most natural ally of Germany. And this was created with the Dual Alliance of 1879. And eventually, he will align with the so-called Central Powers as a safeguard against the possibility of a Russian attack. Or of a war with Russia. Russia was a difficult ally, because Russia looked at Germany with great skepticism and saw Germany as a real potential competitor. And as a result of that, Germany and Russia at this time engaged in some pretty intense kind of what we might call today economic warfare, where Germany placed large tariffs on Russian products and Russians placed large tariffs on German products, and so forth. And so there was a sort of natural hostility between Russia and Germany. So while Russia is kind of this natural, in a sense, a natural enemy, unlike the French, where Bismarck basically knows there's no way you're creating any kind of alliance with the French, Russia nonetheless was a country that Bismarck still wanted to appeal to, in the sense of trying to prevent them from becoming involved in a major war against Germany on all fronts. And so Bismarck was able to create a neutrality treaty with Russia. And this was very important because Bismarck wants to prevent the two-front war in which you have France on one side and Germany and Russia on the other. He also promised not to challenge Great Britain. Now, of course, in the lead up to World War I, during the Wilhelmine era, Germany will build up a massive navy that creates an arms race with Great Britain and caused Great Britain to be highly skeptical of German intentions. But during Bismarck's time, he hoped to, and they tried to make some overtures to Britain for even closer relations, but generally he tries to assure Britain that they will not directly challenge Britain. Germany also limited their overseas colonies, and this was in part because Germany was late to the game of colonialism. They were kind of a new power, and so when they came to be, many of the major areas of colonial activity had really already occurred. But they also do this to avoid antagonizing other imperial powers like the French. Germany colonized areas of West Africa, East Africa, and also German Samoa. But they had a relatively limited overseas colonial empire, though they did have one. And domestic policy was pretty simple. Develop German nationalism and unity through the Kulturkampf, and to keep revolutionary social forces at bay through the usage of fear and legal repression. The alliance systems of Bismarck were very important, and these were originally developed, of course, on the old belief, as I mentioned earlier, in the balance of power. And initially, Bismarck had sought to create a loose alliance, particularly with Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Russia. And of course, as I mentioned in the previous slide, for a brief period of time, he was able to do this. It was during the period of Kaiser Wilhelm II, which we'll be talking about next week, in which that kind of fragile alliance system was done away with in favor of what becomes known as the Triple Alliance, which was the central powers of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. And of course, by 1914, Europe and the colonial territories were really divided into these two allied blocs, the Triple Alliance and the Triple Entente. And it was this kind of set of continental chess pieces, if you will, that was going to factor fundamentally into the occurrence of the First World War.